I have friends whose child is in one of the supposedly better schools in this district. They're not allowed to run in the playground because they could fall over. It's dangerous. When they go between classes in the corridor, they have to walk single file with their hands behind their back, and they're not allowed to talk to each other. If we then try to put all those people into a box where they have to all act the same way, all those on the spectrum that doesn't fit that box are going to struggle. And we can call that autism. About a quarter of kids around this area homeschool. Younger kids, they do a couple of hours a day. And virtually all of those kids are ahead of where they're the equivalent in the formal education system. Kids can be really annoying and persistently so. And, if both parents are working and they get home and they're tired and the kids are always fighting, they'll start thinking, gee, it'd be nice to calm them down with a few chemicals. In the state that I grew up in, they brought in a law that if you had a community barbecue, people had to go and do a food safety course. But once you start having these professions and these bureaucracies, you need to start expanding their remit. It's like any bureaucracy. There's a lot of pushback that we should ban the COVID vaccines, or we should do this from this side. The other side is saying, this is terrible, anti-vax, shock, horror, we're all going to die. And the best thing that they can do for everyone is make everything as transparent as possible and leave people to then make their decision.
Today, I'm honored to have with us Dr. David Bell, and I'm going to let him self-announce his credentials, of which there are quite a few. He's one of my favorite ministers of public health, or public health experts. I don't know if he genuinely has an MPH, or he's just kind of skipped that to get the PhD. He'll have to tell us. But I find him a rational voice in a world of, I don't know, kind of instrumentalists. I don't mean musicians. I mean people who are using the health apparatus for various type of blunt instrument gains, to bludgeon us into one type of behavior or another. And David refreshingly keeps the real goals in perspective. This old, civil rights expression back from the 60s, keep your eyes on the prize. And Dr. Bell has been able to do that, imploring us during the age of COVID over-vaccination to keep in mind malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, the real scourges of the third world, as it were, and of poverty and whatnot, and not so much not having enough, your fifth COVID booster if you happen to live in, Cameroon or something like that. David, tell us what's top of mind these days, and how would you amend your introduction?
It's good to be here and talk to you again, Randy. Thanks. So, I'm a public health physician and internal physician, originally from Australia. I've also worked in the UK, now live in the US. Have a past history working in the World Health Organization for 8 or 9 years in the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, which is a foundation in Geneva, obviously work on diagnostics. And in a Gates-managed entity, development laboratory near Seattle for several years as Director of Health Technologies there. And I now work in biotech and global health. So I guess I'm a public health physician who's sort of been fairly immersed in low middle income country public health, but lived in wealthier countries, obviously. And I have a MTH, which is like an MPH, but it's tropical rather than public. But that's me. I sort of ended up doing jobs that other people were too smart to do. So I've switched around a bit.
Yeah, you got stuck doing some of the household chores, less glamorous and whatnot. So we could go a bunch of different avenues, but I have to say, I don't know if you finished my article, but I recently wrote on autism, and I tried to. Well, I did come out of it, into it a little bit naive, fresh faced, I guess. I had never, I have no real stake in the autism debate beforehand per se. I mean, I went to medical school long enough ago that autism was not really a term of art. I graduated in 1981, and I think the term was coming about in the 70s, but we didn't really consider or have lectures on autism per se. And so the phenomenon of autism and then an epidemic of something that was not even considered a term of art back then, is a little bit odd. But to kind of leverage off your experience worldwide, globally, one aspect that I found interesting and potentially illuminating in the Sherlock Holmesian sense from the episode The Silver Blaze, the dog that didn't bark in the night. He was noticing the presence of an absence that the dog didn't bark. It pointed to the intruder being somebody known to the household. I don't want to get into that, but Sherlock Holmes was my childhood idol and led a lot of my kind of inquisitive, or it fed into my inquisitive aspects, which maybe pre-existed. But in this case, the dog that didn't bark in the night in the autism story, post 1970s and 80s and beyond, when it became kind of this epidemic in the industrialized world, is the fact that it's not in the non-industrialized world. And I'm wondering whether you have any kind of perspective or firsthand knowledge, if any, on the kind of the total absence of articles and essays of autism for, I don't know what fraction, say half the world's population or something like that, which doesn't seem to consider it much. In China, which is industrialized, say, it's poo-pooed and whatnot. People don't really spend the time and so forth. I'm just wondering if you have any sense and sensibility about that.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. As an example, I did at one stage general practice training, family doctor training in Australia, and I remember a colleague who was from China. She commented to me that in China she'd never really heard of depression, and there was no depression. But actually, after working in Australia, she realised how many of her patients in China had been depressed, and no one looks for that diagnosis. So I think one of the reasons why a lot of these more psychological diseases or mental cognition diseases or differences, and we shouldn't use the word disease, we'll come back to that. I'm trying to think of the right term as we talk, but differences in the way that people behave are not necessarily recognized in some countries and cultures because they have more important priorities in health, or because they are happier with a greater diversity of human behavior. And because of the way the culture is structured, they can get away with it. CDC reports a huge increase in autism in the US over the last 30, 40 years, and particularly in boys. So that could well be a real thing, obviously, and a lot of people are insistent and probably right, I think, that there is a real increase in this. And we'll come back to why, but we can assume it's likely to be multifactorial. The other issue is, I've got two kids, and we're fortunate we can homeschool them. I know that if we didn't, at least one of them we'd be pressured by a school to medicate the child. I have friends whose child is in one of the supposedly better schools in this district, and he's a boy. They're not allowed to run in the playground because they could fall over. It's dangerous, so they can't play, chasing each other, etc. They can't run in the playground. These are boys and girls, and when they go between classes in the corridor, they have to walk single file with their hands behind their back, and they're not allowed to talk to each other. So this is a normal state school in Texas. And if you put a human child in that situation. And human child, they're young mammals. And I have sheep, yeah, and you look at the lambs and they play constantly. Young mammals play, young mammals are active, they learn by doing things. If you put them in a box, then you would expect them to go mad. So if you put young children, human children, in a situation where 8 or 9 hours a day, they have absolutely structured time, they cannot be physically move physically normally. They're not allowed to talk to each other. They're not allowed to be spontaneous at all, which is how we run most of our school systems. Then you would expect these children, and I think particularly boys, to start responding to that in a way that isn't, that they will rebel against that, or they will develop behavioral traits which are poorly fitted to getting on with other kids. And we can call that autism or ADHD or other things on a spectrum. And the spectrum is important because all humans are not the same. We're all born with different genetics, different development, different nutrition, different parents, different environment. We're all going to be a little bit different. So we're all on the spectrum. And a spectrum means there are some people more different than others, and that is normal society. If we then try to put all those people into a box where they have to all act the same way, all those on the spectrum that doesn't fit that box are going to struggle. And some of them will develop traits or rebelliousness or whatever that is a response to that. And we can call that autism. We can dose them with sedatives or other drugs which will change their behavior and make them more compatible with those that fit in the box. And we can apply a label to them. But I think to a large extent, that is what we're doing in Western countries. If you go to other countries, often you won't see that. And so it may be they're not recognizing these, but it may be that they're not forcing kids to go down that path as well.
There's a lot of wisdom there. I would, just as a caveat to our audience, make the distinction between ADD and autism. I think that autism has had diagnostic creep or diagnostic bleed into, say, more normal situations of kind of normal or high intelligence. Elon Musk, self-proclaims to be autistic, and that's different from the original diagnosis, which tended to be much more in the mental retardation, now quote unquote intellectual disabled category. So there's been a lot of movement in that. But autism and they've also allowed kind of ADD to coexist as a diagnosis of autism. So there's kind of capture all around. It's a little bit of like a special ed battlefield, and I think there are some financial incentives that pervert things somewhat diagnostically and treatment-wise and so forth in the United States, where there's money for this, and not necessarily in other countries. So we see a lot more of ADD. We see a lot more autism than ever before. And I think you're absolutely right as far as the boy aspect. I think that boys and girls are different. They're genetically different right from the beginning. XX and XY are big differences, the way things play out physically. And as far as the brain formation and needs and desires and interests and whatnot, conversation. And I think schools, not initially, but they've come to be kind of a feminized, I would say playground, but then there's not that enough play in the guy sense. The guy's prototypical play is king of the hill, defined kind of mastery and dominance and skill sets and physical aggression, working out. Like as far as those little lambs, I imagine there's a lot of butting heads, like literally, for the lambs and rams and whatnot. And boys do that as well, and girls less so. And I think school, what's become is kind of a quasi daycare and not just daycare for kids, but kind of a capture so that we can have the women out working. So we have a society dual income households, and the kids have to be someplace. So they're in some place that's organized, and along the way, I guess they'll learn French and social studies or something like that. Fine, but it's far in excess of what I think the template needs in order to become a reasonable functioning human elsewhere. Because how do I know that? I mean, like both my grandparents had none of that. They probably went through elementary school, and they both were successful in their own ways, running businesses for themselves and others and whatnot. And literally, elementary school had all the elements 100 years ago that you needed to function in society. And if you didn't even go to do that, a lot of people didn't do that, and they could do manual labor. So they could all your masons and whatnot. The people who built the Sistine Chapel, aside from say Michelangelo's paintings and whatnot, I bet if you kind of squeeze them all together, in an espresso machine, you'd find maybe zero years of formal education for the people who actually built the thing. So who knows? I mean, all through history, education's been for a certain class. I mean, the liberal arts, the term itself is kind of a Roman thing for the liberated people, the actual Roman citizens, in order to stay free themselves, not the slave class, not the other class.
Well, and the way we do education, I think you're right that a lot of school is daycare. About a quarter of kids around this area are homeschooled where I live, and most kids, I think, younger kids, they do a couple of hours a day, and that's it. If they're homeschooling, and virtually all of those kids are ahead of where they, the equivalent in the formal education system. But the formal education system, they're spending about 8 hours a day in the school, 8.5 hours. So most of that is lining up, sitting down, being quiet, waiting for someone else. And I think it's a huge issue. I think that we're forcing these kids, a lot of them, to develop abnormal traits. We're trying to force them into a box where they don't fit psychologically, mentally. And, as you said, Michelangelo was good at painting the chapel. Other people were good at putting the blocks together. And now we're trying to force everyone essentially to go to college and to be pretty much the same, to go through the same sort of education system. And I think, I suspect that part of the behavioral traits that we're discussing, whether it's autism or ADHD or whatever, are related to that. I don't think, or they become more obvious because in a much more diverse society and way of bringing up kids, the kids that have a certain trait can do this, and the kids that have another trait can do something else, and they cope. And society is broad enough that everyone has a place and has a role. But if you try to force everyone into the same box, then you're going to make those differences much more obvious.
Yeah, I think it cuts both ways. I mean, if we go back to, say, the feudal Middle Ages societies and whatnot, agrarian, you had to kind of like pull the wheat together or roll things into town. I don't think people were interested in their various neurodivergences, nor did they have the time or the luxury to do so. It was more of a subsistence level, and you pulled your weight or you didn't, and you probably didn't get pulled along if you didn't do that. So it was kind of a societal compact that your physical needs were necessary, your physical abilities were necessary, and less so your mental ones. And if you could somehow levitate yourself upwards and become a consul to the king or whatever, or the local lord or whatever, then fine. And maybe you became a scribe or something like that. But for the most part, I think a lot of these things probably existed, and we coexisted with them, because that was what society is. And we've been talking a little bit about autism, ADD, diagnosis, and so forth, and the kind of the way it plays out, perhaps in other societies that are less. I suppose they're less fortunate in a lot of different ways. So we're more fortunate. We have, we pretty much have our subsistence needs met for housing and food, clothing, shelter. That's redundant, and I guess health. And so I think we wind up extrapolating. And if this is a verb, we're a little bit more omphaloskeptic. We, have the ability to spend time gazing on our own navels and figuring things out. We don't have the impetus and the urge or the need to, kind of get out and solve things for ourselves. So we get abstracted. So we have the internet, we have discussions, people troll each other. They have time to, form Instagram, cabals and bully people. And I mean, it's just kind of a lot of stuff going on. I'm kind of happy I'm not a teenager today. And all these various social stresses. And then people, I think, take refuge in certain labels. We've seen this kind of gender dysphoria and LBGTQIA plus, et cetera, grow in a sense astronomically from the numbers which were non-existent when I was a kid. And I think people take some refuge. Now, I do not think, strict severe autism is that. I think that is something that is a mental disorder. I think it's that's not the same thing, but, schizophrenics have, whatever people think of psychiatry for the kind of the neurotic, the Woody Allen crowd. I think that there is a genuine schizophrenia where people genuinely delusional. They have, that is something hard to deny, and that's an actual brain disease. And I think autism is similar in that severe autism is a genuine, problem the way that the brain is, figured out its network or one way or another, and things got, say, cross-wired or screwed up or whatever. These are not technical terms. So I want to put those things to the side. I think severe schizophrenia is, whether a psychiatrist is the right person or not is another question, but that's a real thing. And I think severe autism is a real thing. So, I think there's a hardcore nugget of each of those types of things where they're brain disorders. But in the kind of the softer parameters, I think there's a little bit of overdone aspect. And I'm going to lead with a personal anecdote, if you'll let me, because I have two adult men, but they were little back when. And one of them, they over and over again, the schools wanted to give him the ADD diagnosis. They wanted him to be on medication because he was, rambunctious, running around, fidgety, whatever. But at home, his thought process was fine. And so just very briefly, he was having trouble writing. And they're like, oh, well, he needs an aid. He needs to be on Ritalin. And I'm an MD, and I just have my own feelings and proclivities. And I was doing dictation for my own work using Dragon at the time. And it's been out for 30 something years, maybe. And so when we would go, I'd ask him a topic, and let's say it was the Gettysburg Address or something, be walking around the block. I'm like, well, what was the context of that? What was going on? And he knew all this stuff. And he knew why they were doing it. He knew the situation of the war. He's really interested in all the, the battles that had gone on. He had kind of a boy's interest in all this stuff. And so I said, well, what's the question that the teacher wants to know? She wants to know this and that. I don't know. I'm just making this up as, proxy example. And so I took I had a little, hard drive recording thing, handheld, and I took it around with us when we were walking the dog. I'm like, so I'd ask him like 10 questions about whatever the topic was. And he answered them fine. And all I did was transcribe his words, and I put it into a document. And I said, here, have at it, write your essay. And he did fine. He was able to take all his formed thoughts, which were his thoughts. There was no ChatGPT, no cribbing, nothing, no cheating. And he took all those things and he made essays. The teacher's like, oh, you have to stop writing his essays for him. She called me at the class. I'm like, I am not writing his essays for him. It's like, well, how did they get so much better all of a sudden? You are writing his essays. I'm like, I told her the method. And she kind of like didn't, had to like, she went through her referee mind to see if that was legal. What were we doing? He wasn't sitting and writing. Like, well, writing is conversation. Writing is transcribed conversation, ideally. And the whole purpose of things like the Bible and whatnot is to get the stories down. We have stories where we're creatures of narrative. And anyway, so, I haven't been able, nobody's made me king or head of the school system, whatever. But, I think there's lots of gaps in the way they apply things. They have a hammer and everyone's a nail. And I think some people are maybe, screwed, different types. Maybe you need an Allen wrench. Maybe you need a Phillips head, whatever. I think everything has to be approached differently, and they don't really have that. I mean, they've kind of branched out in the special ed world, but but in a sense perversely, because they get more jobs out of that. And I don't think they're necessarily.
And it shouldn't be special ed. I mean, we shouldn't say it's special needs. It's is it overdiagnosed, or are we just intolerant to diversity in kids? I think mostly. I agree that there is a real thing of autism. There's a real thing of schizophrenia and so on. But a lot of certainly, I think with children, a lot of it is just intolerance. Kids can be really annoying and persistently so. And if both parents are working and they get home and they're tired, and the kids are always fighting, they'll start thinking, "Gee, it'd be nice to calm them down with a few chemicals." But um, in the end, you've got developing brains and neurological connections forming and all the rest of it. And you would think logically, the last thing you'd want to do, it would only in extremes would you stick chemicals in there that are going to change the way that brain is thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's a template for, I think it's an odd message. I treated narcotic addicts for probably a decade. I mean, I saw them at different points otherwise, but, as a concerted effort, I treated them for a decade. And there's an old joke. There's two types of people, people who fall into categories and people who don't fall into categories. But in this case, most people who had seen other physicians or other treatment centers, methadone and whatnot, for their narcotic issue, they were all under the impression they had a disease of narcotics. And again, I don't know what happened to me, but maybe I wasn't dropped in my head often enough. But I saw this as a societal, the famous narcotic addict and writer, the Beat Generation writer, he influenced, Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, was William Burroughs. And he was the heir to the Burroughs typewriter fortune and whatnot, I believe. But he wrote Naked Lunch, and he labeled this, I think, correctly. He said narcotic usage or heroin addiction, whatever, is a disease of exposure. So if it's a disease at all, it's only something that you get because the thing is around. 1,000 years ago, if you went to some, I don't know, South America 1,000 years ago, there was no, heroin addiction because they didn't have heroin. And maybe in Central Asia they did have, opium addiction. But where you didn't have opium, you didn't have opium addiction. It was hard to have coffee addiction before there was coffee. It was hard to be, addicted to nicotine before people had cigarettes. So these things were, imported and brought in. People found their likes and dislikes. But my only point is that as far as the paradigm goes, a lot of the labels we give and the drugs we give to kids gives them a template for that being an internal problem. When you give them the ADD diagnosis and here's a pill for it, you've diseaseified, you've medicalized the issue. And so as far as getting back to my narcotic addicts briefly, I told them, look, I think it's not a great thing. You have an addiction. That's a word for it called addiction. You don't need another word for it. It doesn't have to be a disease. And you can de-addict. People get off coffee. They get off alcohol. They get off all kinds of things. Tiger Woods, I think, was a sex addict or whatever they called him. But I don't think he's to the same extent now. If you age out of certain things and you change your behaviors. And so I think it's something that you can, deal with and you can change. And people are, they actually, whether I'm right or wrong, it is not necessarily the central point. It's really the empowerment by thinking that you have a way out of it. You are going to fight harder. If you think you're just kind of locked in, then you're done, I think, as far as some of these things go. And when we give the ADD diagnoses and we give them a pill, I think that locks into kids' mind for the duration that they're going to need this pill in order to do well at their tasks. And I think that takes away their self-confidence. Getting back to my, son, in this case, he never went on any pills like that. And doesn't mean he was a straight A student, but he's really accomplished a lot. And he's never resorted to, pills to get his work done. And when he doesn't get his work done, he blames, his, computer games or whatever, which is fine, but it's a matter, I think that what we all need is kind of the ability and the template to get ourselves out from where we are. And I don't think that's helped by a fair amount of medical framework.
Yeah, there's a good book on this come out recently, which I think you probably know, by Laura Delano. unshrunk, and she she was diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder and various other labels, disease labels, as a teenager, and spent a decade or two on medications and a decade or two getting off. And so it's a good, I'm actually a slow reader. That's one. I'm on the spectrum of struggling to read words, but I have read that one. And it's really worth it because it says exactly what you were saying, that the danger of putting labels, disease labels on people because they're going through a hard time, or they are on a certain part of the behavioral spectrum that is humanity. And once you put a disease label on, then you start blaming the disease and you stop getting yourself to a state of better functioning on your own, or that's the danger. So, so I mean, getting back to the autism bit, I think, I mean, it's hard. Autism is interesting because it's not, I guess it's not a disease in the same way. It's not something that is so dependent on medications, but it's a label which probably changes the way that people see their future. I mean, I just think we should talk about the issue of whether it's becoming more common or not. Are we seeing more severe autism cases? And this is what you discuss in your paper. And then, the obvious question that people want to talk about is whether vaccines have a role in that, whether other environmental influences have a role in that, etc. And I think, it's an extremely difficult issue if you're trying to work out what is abnormal and what is normal and what has actually changed, and then trying to work out for a quite whereas mild and non-specific diagnosis, what the actual influences that have caused that or caused that change. So I think you conclude in your paper that it's complicated. Is that fair?
Yeah, well,
you're not putting a reason for it. You're not putting a number on it.
No, but it's kind of like I don't know, if a fly goes into your spaghetti, you can throw the whole dish out, or if the spaghetti's dear to you, you might sift through and pull out the good strands, and try to get rid of that fly, and that's that. Maybe you strain it again and put it back together. There's like two categories. Get back to categories. There's two categories of people. There are people who can throw the food away and order another dish, and other people who just kind of brushed off. So as far as this goes, I just don't think you can make any categorical statements about what autism is until you figure out which strands of the spaghetti are good and which one are not. Keeping with the spaghetti theme, I got to say we had Italian friends, not Italian American, not Tony Soprano kind of third generation, but emigres from Italy when our kids were young, and at one point we served them dinner, and I think my wife put one type of spaghetti in that she was going to put linguine in, and that's like a huge cultural sin, to mix types of pasta in one sitting. So there are some cultural aspects. Anyway, as far as the spaghetti analogy, I like this one because autism is a lot like that. Even if you just have a whole bowl of autism spaghetti, there's still going to be multiple strands. This one is this. This one is more kind of physical, developmental. This one's Asperger's. This one is they've got all these kind of things. This one's intellectually intact. This one's kind of what we used to say mentally retarded or slow and intellectually disabled, so forth. There's not one illness. It's not like malaria, I think, and it's not like say rickets or something like that, which you can see, say, post, God forbid you die, post autopsy, or you can see a heart attack on autopsy. Now, autism, I don't think you can see currently on autopsy. Maybe someday they'll have, kind of minute, brain mapping, electrical, so forth, and see something that looks like schizophrenia. See something. I do think that there's something that happens along the way. Obviously in Down syndrome, there's something that happened, and that's genetic, and pure genetic. There's Rett syndrome, RETT, where there's an intellectual, dysfunction, and you can obviously see it. And there's Cri du Chat, there's other, genetic aspects where there's huge Tay-Sachs and whatnot, where there's huge intellectual disability. So things can happen genetically with the malformation and so forth. Then there's kind of the other aspect, which is things that are happening as your brain forms that aren't strictly speaking genetic, but the gene code, if you want to think of it as music, music's being played, but maybe you got the bad orchestra. You got the third grade orchestra instead of the New York Philharmonic playing it. And so the notes get played out. Maybe there's a few missing, and it kind of gets played out in an odd way. David, what's kind of top of mind? I was going to spring upon you the one of my pet things. Every now and then I go to the cover page of the American Journal of Public Health, and I look through the article. So you have had an interest in public health, I gather, and I'm wondering, what is here? I'll just read. This is kind of typical. The June issue of AJPH, the American Journal of Public Health, features a special section on power, politics, human rights, and public health. So Medicaid expansion, the influence of community health workers, U.S. pregnancy centers. Let's see, the study of power, the far right, and public health. So here's an editorial. Health-focused arguments for eliminating overcrowding in prisons, jails, and other detention facilities. Another one here is the continuing public health challenge of crisis pregnancy centers. So we can stop at those two. And I think, I hope our audience understands, like my implication here is that this is a journal, I don't think so much of public health as a way of using the concept of public health for political means. How far off am I?
I think that's right. And there's more to it than that, I think. I think it's just an industry that it needs to survive. I'm a public health physician, postgraduate training and so on. And so I have, the letters after my name in Australia as a public health physician. About 40 years ago, there's no such thing as that. You had physicians and whatever, then they introduced Master of Public Health or whatever, so you could have a bit more training in epidemiology and, what causes diarrhea in a restaurant and that sort of thing. Then you started graduating these people, then you had physicians, public health physicians, etc. And as you get more and more of these people, then they're going to go out of business or they need to find more things to do. So it's, you're smiling, Randy, but we've built this huge public health bureaucracy that never used to exist in the last 40 or 50 years, mostly in the last 20 or 30 years. And we now have thousands of people whose livelihood depends on, exactly the things that you were reading out. That that there's issues in Australia about should we ban rock fishing? Should we, the state that I grew up in, they brought in a law that if you had a community barbecue, people had to go and do a food safety course, and you had to have a windbreak around two sides of the barbecue so leaves don't blow on. I'm 99% sure that in the whole history of Australia, no one has died because leaves blew onto a barbecue. But once you start having these professions and these bureaucracies, you need to start expanding their remit. It's like any bureaucracy. And I think in public health, this is a large part of what we're seeing. You mentioned it in the autism issue that people are paid to be special needs teachers. And fine, there are some kids with special needs, but when you have a lot of special needs teachers, then you drop the threshold for the kids that have special needs because the teachers need something to do, and then you may start needing more teachers. Oh, all these ones are busy now, so we'll train some more teachers. We'll have more kids with special needs, and this is sort of inevitable. And gun violence becomes a public health problem. Racism becomes a public health problem. Everything's becoming a public health problem. So you're right. I think there's some political thing in here in that people worry about health. Health is very powerful psychologically. No one wants to be sick. No one wants to die. So when you start talking, as we saw in COVID, about risk and about health, then you can change people's behavior. You can get people to follow you. And so public health, not as a profession, but as an area of work, has always been very susceptible to this. So, the European fascism lent very heavily on public health, on the idea that certain ethnic groups were spreading disease, that, even, the sort of eugenic industry in the United States and North America, where it was very strongly, it was public health schools that sort of wanted to improve the human race by mass sterilization and so on. And these are all, it's a very powerful tool to use for politics. But I think where it has gone really wrong in the last decade or two is because it has become, there are just so many people in the field, and speaking as one of them. So health and climate is a big thing in my area of work, and I'm, to a large extent, a malariologist. I've worked a lot on malaria in the past. There's a big push now, and there's articles in the Lancet and so on about malaria getting worse because of climate change. And the evidence for this is extremely thin. Malaria is getting worse for other reasons. It's getting worse because of the mosquitoes are getting resistant to the insecticides that are on bed nets. The parasites are getting resistant to the drugs that we commonly use. There's some issues with diagnosis, and poverty's got worse through COVID and other means, and malaria goes with poverty. Climate change has made almost no difference to malaria. There's a little bit of extension of malaria to higher altitudes in mountainous areas like Papua New Guinea and Ethiopia. But, where it's predicted to make a difference in the temperate areas where, it'll spread further north back into Europe and south, they're the countries that are eliminating malaria successfully. So, but yet there's there's huge funding now for malaria and climate change. Not because there's good evidence, but because there's a whole industry now developing around health and climate that needs to be fed. And you need to find reasons for feeding it because there are a lot of people employed there. So, so we are seeing, you inevitably, these issues become bigger problems. I don't think this is completely divorced actually from where we started, which is around autism either.
Yeah.
The whole idea of when you have a lot of people whose sole existence is on fixing kids, then you find reasons in the kids to be fixed. And like what you mentioned, we actually had an issue with a child, one of our children was supposedly slow in language development. And with no cost to us, we could have had a huge investment from the state that we were in at that time in improving our child's speech. I mean, our child was actually a little bit behind in English, but speaking two other languages as well, and now won't stop talking. And it was clear to us that this wasn't an issue. But even when this happened, it was sort of put to us, but it's no problem for you. You don't have to pay.
Right. No, it's a great thing. Other people, it's called OPM, other people's money.
Yeah,
I got to
and,
say,
and I can understand how it all happens. And I've worked most of my life on government money or on philanthropist money. Yeah, so I'm a parasite in a lot of ways in the way that I've worked as well, and so I can see how easily that can happen.
yeah, it's a funny thing. I have a quick story. One of my kids, as a kid, uh, was big for his age, and at a certain point at the school, they had kind of smushed together a couple of the grades, like nursery and kindergarten, whatever. It was a Montessori school, and so their kids' first grade, whatever. So there was a wide swath of ages, and that's fine. They were kind of play stuff and whatnot. So I didn't even know the school had a speech therapist. She comes up to me at one of the picnics and said, "Your son, I think, needs speech therapy." I'm like, "What's going on?" I mean, I didn't notice anything odd. She's like, "Well, he has trouble pronouncing. He can't say. He says lello or yellow, stuff like that." Uh, Whatever. I mean, it's something clearly he's going to outgrow, over time. I don't think he's going to become whatever CEO and still say Lello. Anyway, I said, well, I think his real problem, the problem with his speech is that he's too tall. And so she kind of like, oh, she's like, I could see she rolls her eye back and like, oh my God, I've got a moron parent here. So she repeats the whole thing to me. And I said, yeah, no, I get it. I totally get it. But I think the problem is he's too tall. She's like, what? I said, well, let me ask you a question. How old is he? How old is he?
Mm,
He's like, I think he's like 6. I said, well, he's about to turn 4.
yeah.
She says, oh my God, he's so tall.
Yeah.
I'm like, my work here is done. but you can see her, she just like, it was like kind of a world changing moment. Her face, blushed a little bit. And because she had blurted it out, oh my God, he's so tall. And I don't know if that changed anything, but this was a private school. It was not public school. But nonetheless, she had to be there for whatever reason. The parents are all concerned, and we live in a world. And the cohort of kids, of parents who send their kids to Montessori school are same parents who expect their kids to become CEOs and whatnot, and they don't want that CEO to be going around Lello and whatnot. But it's just kind of a funny predicament. I think it says a lot about the times more than about my kid. And maybe it says something about my kind of snarky attitude, and maybe the fact I wasn't medicated enough, or still I'm not. But it's like, I think people just kind of take everything because it's an authority, and that's what they have to do. And I think the homeschool movement is interesting for that purpose. And one other thing, well, since I'm kind of free riffing here, is the fact that the kids can do the public school stuff in a couple hours. I had patients when I worked in a blue collar town near Boston. Over the years, I was there 30 years practically, and I had postal workers and policemen and whatnot as my patients, amongst others. And one of the new postal workers, he came in. And he's like, "Oh my God, they're so angry at me because he's a mail carrier." And like, what's up? He's like, well, I do my route. It takes me like an hour and a half. And I come back and I ask if there's more mail. I'm like, no, that was an 8-hour route. It's like, no, I did an hour and a half. It's like, no, it's an 8-hour route. You
Yeah.
do that, make that last 8 hours. That you do this an hour and a half. You're going to ruin everything for everybody here. And so he's just like miserable. He's having to figure out ways to become a bad worker. And I
Mm,
see it out walking around. I see in the summertime it's kind of interesting because they have these kind of upside down U-shaped repositories for the mail. And some of the now that we have kind of more diverse male and female carriers for us, I see some of the women like sort of fit themselves into that thing as a shelter on the hot days, and they got a cool drink, and they're inside the mail receptacle, I'm not going to make any puns about that, but kind of whiling the hours away, on their phone or whatever, playing, I don't know, Candy Crush or something like that. And God knows, we don't necessarily need postal mail at all. And we have it's just kind of a funny thing. There's a certain amount of uh, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work attitude. That's as we kind of automate more tasks, we get away from the agrarian feudal society, which is wonderful. But now we have the issue of kind of indolence and make pretend, and we can have a society where we can afford to pay people to do jobs that they can do 4 times as fast and not.
Yeah, we don't really have that society. We have a society that thinks it can afford that. But, we're actually running on debt to do that. So, which, eventually will come back to haunt us, or haunt our children. So, I think, that what's happened to USAID is a good example of this, I think, and it comes to how do you fix this problem? And it is a huge problem. I think it's a problem with the World Health Organization that, and it's ever expanding, and the global health industry that I'm in is there's more and more public-private partnerships and NGOs and so on, or there has been over the last 2 decades, and it's the same within this country. And it's difficult because you need some of this work, but as you grow the industry, it inevitably grows beyond what is needed and starts finding new areas to busy itself. And it's extremely hard to just shave off little bits of that. And so it's a very unpopular opinion in my profession, but I think probably what happened to USAID was to a large extent necessary, because I think you can't just keep growing and growing and growing this. And in the end, countries have got to stand on their own 2 feet in terms of public health and foreign aid, and there will always be a need for help to countries to cooperate and help each other. But it's in the end, as you said, with addiction and so on as well, you've also got to help yourself. And we build on an international level and on our local level, we've built this sort of welfare state, which has grown beyond what is sustainable and what makes sense, and has become a sort of something that sort of feeds on the population it's supposed to be providing welfare for. So I think this reflects a lot of the public health problems at the moment that we have, and the expanding nature of them. And, we've been sitting here talking about these problems. How do you fix them is extremely difficult. And I think probably you have to go through a lot of pain in order to do this. How do you fix a school system when there are so many people employed and their livelihoods depend on these kids being seen as sick and poorly fitting and needing special help? So how do you pair that back to the kids that really need help, or they're not going to get anywhere, and help the others to be
it's a tricky point.
self-helping?
I don't know if you know the Dunning-Kruger curve, but it's kind of a U-shaped curve. And I'm not putting that out except as an analogy for U-shaped curve. There are people that can be helped and will do well, and there are people who are going to be helped and not have any benefit per se. I had Jill Escher on, and she's an attorney and the head of the National Council on Severe Autism. And she has 2 out of her 3 now adult children are severely autistic, and to the point where they, can't really speak the language and whatnot, and they're never going to be employable and so forth. But we got to I asked her an uncomfortable question, which is, okay, so you have the special ed aides and teachers and, curriculum, whatever. And at the end of the day, and the end of, the end of childhood, entering adulthood, your kids can't really speak English. Like we just, I went to Las Vegas and all I got was, my parents went to Las Vegas. All I got was this lousy T-shirt. So we spent, say, I don't know, I don't know, $250,000, say for each kid or something, like whatever the number happens to be. And your kid, I mean, what should we have done? Is that the best use of that money? If we had taken that, $200,000, something like that, and put it in a trust fund when the kid's 4 years old or seven or something like that, would the kid be better off today than having spent all that money on A's? And you put the kid in some kind of, like, like the old days, some kind of institution, maybe, put a happy face on it. So there's, gardens and whatnot, and people, can do things and so forth. But to have kind of the individualized special aids for all these kids, and at the end of the day, did you fix anything? That's an open question. To that same point, I was watching a video of psychiatrists convention on Instagram, and it looked a little bit dated, like it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And the reporters just asked, going up to one psychiatrist after another, has any of your patients ever been cured?
Mm.
And they were all like, Now, it's just an interesting prospect. I mean, you do so much. I mean, you do so much, and then did it do anything? It makes us feel good that we did something. It's kind of like the antibiotic for the cold concept. The patients want the antibiotic. They have a cold, say. They got, let's say you have documented rhinovirus. They all want an antibiotic, amoxicillin or something like that. And then you do it, perhaps. I didn't, but you do it, perhaps, because you're going to you got to keep them quiet. They're going to be happy. Not going to do anything. But everyone wants that thing where you did something. You put a Band-Aid on, you kiss it, we did something.
Yeah.
But did it really do anything? And that's what, and under duress, you're going to have, make societal changes and questions about whether these things are, continuable. Ben Stein's late father, Herb Stein, worked on the Council of Economic Advisors for Nixon, said, very kind of Belichickian quote, like our famous Patriots coach, he said, that which cannot continue doesn't. If you have the system that's onerous, burdensome, ineffective, and hugely expensive and endlessly growing, you can't necessarily keep up with it.
No, and then it's the people that do need something that suffer. So if you give antibiotics to everyone with a sore throat, it's unsustainable, and you also bacterial resistance. Sometimes someone has pneumonia and they need antibiotics. If you make the system unsustainable, then you're harming the people that actually really do benefit from help. And this is where we're going, I think, with this whole problem, that we're making so many people be seen as abnormal and needing help, that those that will actually benefit are going to be lost in the unsustainability of the whole system.
So we're kind of rounding out our hour. As is my habit, I talk too much. So I'm going to give you the floor for the final couple of minutes. Tell us what people should know, what they can do. What are your kind of thoughts? You can maybe touch on some of the RFK Jr., HHS, MAGA things, the ACIP firings, anything else that's top of mind, and send us on our way.
I think they're good. I think generally all that direction is good. There's a lot of pushback that we should, ban the COVID vaccines, or we should do this from this side. The other side is saying, this is terrible, anti-vax, shock horror, we're all going to die. And I think what they need to do, the best thing that they can do for everyone, is make everything as transparent as possible and leave people to then make their decision. So if you take the COVID vaccines, that they should be making it really clear what the results of the trials were, which most people got no idea, even doctors. Making that really clear, making recommendations based on those, and then giving people a choice of what the direction they go. I think the ACIP thing is interesting, the sacking of the Vaccine Council. If you look at some of the recordings from meetings, it had become really a rubber stamp. And it is true that most vaccines on the schedule, arguably all, haven't had really strong placebo-controlled trials, and they should have, and they should be insisting on that. So I think the direction, it seems slow to a lot of people, but it's only been a few months. I think the direction of this general area is good. If they can increase the transparency around vaccines, around chemicals in food and all the rest of it, and give people genuine choices, then that's the most that we can hope for.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. David Bell. I appreciate your time with us. And people can find you on X at, what do you go by?
Oh, Bell00 David.
Very much to the point. So thank you, David. And then thereupon they can follow your work. And you're also at brownstone.org, as have been I. So that's all for today.